Ragnarok Rising, the Draugr's Curse. Chapter 1. Ragnar, the Scout. Cold winds howled across the rocky cliffs like the screams of lost spirits, but Ragnar paid them no mind. The young Viking pulled his furs tighter and trekked onward, following the faint trail only his keen eyes could discern. Where others saw only bleak wilderness, Ragnar found adventure. Ever since he was a child, Ragnar had felt the call of the unknown. He was lanky and lean, built for ranging ahead of hunting parties, not for grappling in the shield wall. Ragnar explored every hidden valley and foggy fjord he could find, sometimes gone for days. He'd return with tales of new lands and discoveries that made him an oddity among his people. They shook their heads, dismissing Ragnar as useless for proper rating. But something stirred in the wind today that spelt ill fortune. Ragnar had been tracking a small herd of elk when he came across the corpses. Their bodies were drained and ravaged in unnatural ways. No predator Ragnar knew of killed like that. His heart told him darkness had awakened somewhere in these lands. As the shadows grew long, Ragnar hurried back to the Viking camp with growing dread. He hoped the raiding party had not stumbled upon some ancient evil in a faraway land. But as he crested a rise overlooking the settlement, his breath caught at the sight of figures lurching about chaotically. The living dead had risen to plague the Vikings. Ragnar alone had returned to witness the horror creeping upon his people. Ragnar crept silently towards the Viking settlement, crouching behind a tangled hawthorn bush. The camp was in chaos, with unnatural figures staggering about. Their gait was halting, limbs twitching. Ragged snarls drifted on the wind. These were not men, but creatures possessed of some dark magic. Peering closer, Ragnar spotted familiar faces now distended by rigor mortis. His heart sank as he recognized Jorn, a burly raider who loved testing his strength against young recruits. But no breath stirred Jorn's chest now, only a predator's hunger as he lunged at fleeing people. Other zombie Vikings swarmed over the camp, spreading their plague. The living defenders swung axes and swords with little effect. Blades only slowed the zombies, not granting the true death. Cursed sorcery strengthened the undead. Ragnar watched with despair. Just 2 days prior, Jorn and 30 others had set sail to raid a cluster of villages rumored to be wealthy but strange. Ragnar had begged to go along as scout, hungry for new horizons. But the raiders mocked his slender size, denying him a place. How different matters could have been if Ragnar had been allowed to follow the signs and portents he read like runes. There would be time later for regrets. Ragnar slowly retreated from the ridge, circling wide around the still-growing mass of zombies. He had to leave immediately to find answers before the Viking settlement was lost utterly. This cursed evil could spread like a plague through the lands if not stopped quickly. Ragnar's mind turned to old songs of walking dead and dark magics. There were whispers of such things in the far northern wastes. He would begin his search there among the lonely glacial valleys. Perhaps some elder with forgotten knowledge could show Ragnar how to break these zombies' hold on his people before it was too late. The cold wind sang a mournful song as Ragnar stole one last look at his now doomed home. Jaw clenched with determination, the scout embarked on his desperate quest, the camp's screams chasing him into the night. Chapter 2. The Lonely Road. The vast emptiness of the open tundra stretched on endlessly before Ragnar as he trekked northward alone. The icy wind howled like a beast in pain, cutting through furs and flesh to freeze the very bone. He pulled his cloak tighter, eyes watering against the gale. Days had passed since Ragnar fled the cursed Viking settlement. A hellish vision of the walking dead feasting on his kinsmen seared into his mind. He shook his head angrily. If only they had heeded his warnings. Something unnatural was afoot, instead of dismissing him as a useless daydreamer. Now, the people paid a grim price for their ignorance. Ragnar's path took him ever farther from the scattered domains of men. The frosted plains gave way to jagged ridges cloaked in snow, towering peaks looming beyond, like the spears of ice giants. Few ventured to these remote and unsparing lands, but Ragnar took comfort in the solitude of the wilderness. Out here, the only enemy was nature itself, not the supernatural evil that had shattered his world. As Ragnar climbed into the mist-shrouded mountains, the air grew even more still and frigid. Loose rocks slid treacherously underfoot. He relied on his scout's instincts to find safe passage through the hazardous terrain. Ragnar's ultimate destination was a hidden valley deep in the far north. According to legend, strange wise men older than memory dwelled there. He prayed they could help him save his people. Camping in a sheltered rocky overhang, Ragnar kept a small fire burning through the endless night. The dancing flames held back the darkness as howls echoed in the distance. Ragnar stood a vigilant guard, axe poised, for what may come stalking out of the gloom. Soon he would reach journey's end, but surviving the wilderness could prove the easiest part of his quest. The true test still lay ahead. When dawn's light crept over the mountains, Ragnar stomped out the embers and continued his tireless march. The wind picked up again, seeming to resist his progress. But he was close now. Around a bend, Ragnar spotted the opening to a snow-drifted valley. Oddly shaped stones guarded the entrance like a row of troll sentinels. This was the place, the domain of those who would have wisdom to defeat the zombie plague if the old tales held true. Gripping his axe, Ragnar stepped between the ancient monoliths. An eerie silence greeted him. No birds sang, no animals stirred amidst the rocky crags. Ragnar followed a winding path downwards, snow crunching under his boots. As he descended, the temperature grew warmer, patches of green lichen dotting the valley walls. Ragnar came to a halt when the path opened up, beholding a small settlement of thatched stone huts. Could this be the sanctuary he sought? "Turn back, wayfarer," a stern voice called out, echoing off the valley walls. An elder man with a long gray beard emerged from a hut, leaning heavily on a carved staff. His piercing eyes fixed on Ragnar. "Your kind is not welcome here." Ragnar held his hands out, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "Please, wise one, I seek your counsel to stop a great evil, a plague of the walking dead." The elder's eyes narrowed sharply. "The Draug? We warned your people long ago not to disturb that cursed tomb." He sighed heavily. "Come, we have much to discuss." Over a simple meal, Ragnar recounted his tale as the elder listened intently, his deeply lined face growing ever more grave. Finally, Ragnar finished, pleading for aid against the undead horde. The elder sat in silence for several moments before responding. "You were right to come here. We know magic and rituals, forgotten by the wider world. I cannot promise your people can be saved, but we shall give you the means to combat the Draugr." Ragnar's heart swelled with hope for the first time since the nightmare began. Perhaps there was a chance after all. Chapter 3: Dark Rituals. Ragnar sat cross-legged inside the elder's stone hut as frigid wind howled outside. A small fire flickered, casting dancing shadows over arcane objects lining the walls. The smells of exotic herbs and smoldering incense filled the room. The elder, whose name was Eyvind, slowly poured a cup of murky liquid and offered it to Ragnar. Drink this tonic. It shall protect you from the curse. Ragnar swallowed the bitter concoction without hesitation. Ivan nodded in approval. Now, heed closely, for the ritual I grant you must be followed exactly. The old man pulled an ancient scroll from his robes. This incantation shall shield your mind from the Draugr and allow you to control them for a time. But it requires a sacrifice. Ragnar clenched his fist. My life for my people. Tell me what I must do. Ivan unrolled the scroll, revealing strange symbols and patterns. At the height of midnight, under clear skies, you must burn this parchment soaked with blood from your hand. The smoke shall carry the spell. When you breathe it, the Draugr shall sense you as their master. Reaching towards the fire, Ivan pressed the tip of his staff into the embers. The end glowed red hot. Present your hand. Ragnar gritted his teeth as the searing metal smoked against his skin. Ivan cut a shallow gash in Ragnar's palm, collecting the blood in a bowl to prepare the enchanted ritual. Now heed this warning, Ivan said gravely. The spell's protection will wane. If you do not complete your task before the sun rises again, the Draugr shall turn on you. Ragnar bid the elder farewell at first light, supplied with the ritual parchment. He looked back once at the valley that had been his brief refuge, before turning to face the deathly solitude of the mountains again. The freezing journey tested Ragnar's endurance to its very limits. Arriving haggard at the Viking camp days later, Ragnar was shocked to find it eerily abandoned. The settlement showed signs of a desperate battle against the undead horde, but no corpses remained, living or dead. Exhausted as he was, Ragnar had to push on immediately under cover of darkness to find the Draugr. He suspected where the cursed horde had shuffled off to a sprawling burial complex hidden nearby, filled with plundered tombs. With trembling hands, Ragnar prepared the ritual as midnight approached. The old magic would give him temporary command over the Draugr, but he feared what the coming dawn might bring. Chapter 4: Army of the Dead. The muted crunch of Ragnar's boots across the snow sounded deafening in the still silence surrounding the burial mound. A few torches flickered along the outer wall, abandoned by terrified guards. Ragnar steeled himself and slipped through the stone entryway. Immediately, the stench of decay assailed his nostrils. Shuffling shapes moved in the gloom ahead, the Draugr patrols. Ragnar unslung the satchel, holding the prepared ritual parchment, and steeled himself. He had to time this perfectly. At the precise stroke of midnight by his reckoning, Ragnar held the enchanted parchment over a torch. As the dry page ignited, Ragnar wafted the cursed smoke into his face, chanting the spell Ivan had taught him. The reaction was immediate. The Draugr in the passage jerked their heads towards Ragnar in unison, pupil-less eyes gleaming. He could feel the ritual working, their undead minds now linked to his own. Come, Ragnar commanded with as much authority as he could muster. The lead Draugr began marching towards him, the others falling in step behind. Ragnar led his new undead army deeper through a maze of crypts and tombs, seeking the inner sanctum chamber. More Draugr joined the procession until over 100 walked behind him. Ragnar could sense their hunger kept at bay only by his spell. Up ahead, ornate stone doors marked the burial vault of an ancient king, the focal point of the curse. With a deep breath, Ragnar pushed open the doors. A towering Draugr lord rose from its carved sarcophagus, eyes burning with pale blue fire. It sensed the intruder entering its domain. Ragnar raised his axe and let loose a primal yell as his army of the dead surged into the inner sanctum with him. The final battle against the zombie plague had begun. Ragnar fought through the night against the Draugr Lord and its summoned allies as his undead thralls clashed and fell apart around him. At times, the spell shielded Ragnar's mind, while at others, the connection seemed to waver. Ragnar could feel the ritual waning as dawn approached. With a final burst of determination, he charged forward and buried his axe deep into the Draugr chest. A deafening roar shook the crypt as blinding light erupted from the ancient king's remains. Then silence. Ragnar collapsed in exhaustion. Had he done it? Had the curse been lifted? He crawled forward and pushed open the stone doors, daylight spilling inside. The remaining Draugr crumbled to dust in the sun's rays. Ragnar laughed deliriously before the strength left his body. By Odin's name, he had broken the curse. Chapter 5, Aftermath. Ragnar blinked his eyes open slowly, wincing at the brightness that greeted him. He was lying on a straw mattress in a small hut, daylight streaming through an open window. How did he get here? Awake at last, my friend. Ragnar turned to see Eyvind sitting beside the bed, grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle. I found you passed out in the burial vaults and brought you to recover here. Ragnar jolted upright. The Draugr, the curse, what happened? Eyvind placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Peace, you succeeded. The curse was lifted. Some survivors found their way back to the settlement. Ragnar absorbed this with relief and disbelief. By Odin's name, he had actually done it. The nightmare was over for good. Days passed as Ragnar regained his strength. He learned fragments of what occurred after the ritual. The surviving villagers, no longer hunted by zombies, had followed ancient trails back to their ancestral home. They found Ragnar alive within the crypts. The vanquished Draugr erupted into dust. Ragnar walked through the settlement, helping repair damage and bury the remaining dead. Though the people were grateful, he read the unease on many faces. They would never look at Ragnar the same way again after witnessing his power over the undead. As the Vikings held a great feast celebrating their salvation, Ragnar slipped away under the stars. He had saved his people, but the time had come to embark on a new journey, one he must make alone. The next morning, Eyvind found a note tucked within his doorway. Thank you for everything, my friend. My fate now leads me down a different path. Do not follow. Ragnar paused atop a ridge overlooking the village one last time. Though he had found purpose here for a time, the open road always called him home in the end. With a bittersweet smile, Ragnar turned and embarked toward new horizons. Chapter 6, The Lone Wanderer. The icy wind biting at his face, Ragnar trudged along a forgotten forest path, the snow-capped mountains at his back. Weeks had passed since he left the Viking village for a life on the road once more. Ragnar preferred the wild solitude now. After the shared horror of the Draugr curse, he felt a new divide from the settlers. They honored him as a hero, but also feared the powers he had tapped into. Ragnar could not blame them. He too felt changed in ways he did not fully understand. So he returned to the wilderness and wandering existence he knew best. Ragnar foraged for berries and trapped small game to survive. At night, he took shelter in caves tucked away from well-trod routes. He encountered few fellow travelers in these secluded lands. One frigid dusk, as Ragnar prepared to make camp, he heard a rough commotion on the path ahead. Creeping forward, he spotted a ransacked merchant wagon beset by 5 burly bandits. They yelled and cursed in a foreign tongue, rifles trained on a cowering elderly man. Ragnar's hand tightened on the haft of his axe. Once he would have slipped away unseen, but the old darkness rose within him now. The same rage that fueled him against the Draugr. Gripping his axe, Ragnar charged with a primal roar. The bandits scarcely had time to react before Ragnar was upon them, his axe striking in vicious blows, unrelenting as a winter tempest. Blood sprayed the white snow crimson. In mere moments, 5 bodies lay still around the wagon. Ragnar turned to the shaken merchant, reaching a hand out. But the old man cringed away in fear. "Monster," he cried out, making a warding sign against evil before fleeing into the woods. Ragnar stood alone amidst the aftermath. The violence had erupted from him reflexively, but the merchant's reaction stung deep. Had he become the very evil he once fought? Walking away down the lonely path, Ragnar grappled with his inner darkness. He had ended the zombie threat, but perhaps that was only the beginning of his reckoning. Sighing wearily, Ragnar steeled himself for the long road ahead. Chapter 7. Blood on the Snow. Ragnar sat staring into his campfire, the dancing flames offering little warmth from the coldness creeping into his heart. A week had passed since he saved the merchant from bandits, only to be called a monster in return. Ragnar had not wanted to kill those men, but in the heat of the moment, some primal instinct took over. The same instinct that allowed him to control the Draga. Since that ritual, he felt changed. Shouts and snapping branches disrupted Ragnar's brooding. Bandits again, chasing a young woman through the woods nearby. Gripping his axe, Ragnar went to intervene. But he hesitated this time. Should he unleash that darkness? The woman's screams decided for him. Ragnar rushed into the trees, swinging his axe in a whirlwind of steel. The bandits, for this time, fell before him one by one. As the last collapsed in a bloody heap, Ragnar turned to the woman. "Flee from this place," he told her gently. She obeyed without a word. Ragnar stood alone among the bodies strewn across the snow. The violence came easier each time. He stared at his hands, slick with crimson. A single question haunted him. What am I becoming? Those words echoed in Ragnar's mind over the following days as he wandered. He avoided roads now, sticking to the deepest wilderness. Out here, he couldn't hurt anyone, but nor could he help them. Passing a small village, Ragnar spotted a young boy being harassed by bullies. He yearned to intervene, but stayed back, not trusting himself anymore. The darkness grew inexorably within. That night, Ragnar dreamt of the Draugr. The creatures surrounded him, caressing his shoulders almost fondly. "You are one of us now," they seemed to whisper. "The darkness will never let you go." Ragnar awoke with a start, breathing heavy. "Just dreams," he told himself, but looking at his hands, he imagined blood staining them once more. Chapter 8. Cleansing Fire. Ragnar sat staring into the campfire, watching the flames consume the dry wood. Fire purifies, he thought, cleanses and renews. But could it purge the darkness festering within his own tortured soul? Weeks had passed, wandering alone in self-imposed exile, shunning humanity for their own protection. But the bloody dreams of the Draugr came every night now, whispering to embrace his growing dark power. Ragnar feared he would soon lose this battle. In the village days ago, Ragnar had spotted a remote chapel in the woods. Abandoned and decrepit now, but perhaps still holy. As the last embers of Ragnar's fire died out, he set off by moonlight towards the chapel. He would make one final plea for salvation. Rotted wooden doors creaked open to Ragnar's shove, flakes of paint drifting down. The musky interior was illuminated only by thin shafts of moonlight piercing cracks in the walls. Kneeling before the weathered altar, Ragnar closed his eyes. "All-Father Odin, preserve me," he prayed desperately. "Grant me strength to overcome this shadow within." Only silence answered. But then, a whisper. faint words just at the edge of hearing. Ragnar strained to listen. If you cannot quell the darkness, then you must embrace it fully. Ragnar's eyes shot open. Hallucination? But no, a shadowy figure stood watching him from the rear of the chapel. Ragnar leapt up, axe raised warily. Who are you? Figure glided forward into a bar of moonlight, revealing a face both ancient and ageless. His skin was pale as snow, eyes pools of endless black. I am the Knight Incarnate, the stranger rasped, and I would make you my avenging angel. Ragnar's fingers whitened on his axe haft. I want no dark powers, only redemption. The pale stranger chuckled. Poor fool. You were already damned from the moment you drank Ivan's ritual potion. Ragnar's stomach dropped. Was this the truth underlying the changes in him? Had the Elder's aid carried a hidden cost? The pale stranger extended a clawed hand. Embrace your fate. I shall teach you to master the darkness, not be enslaved by it. Ragnar trembled, feeling forces collide within his soul. This was his final reckoning. With a scream of anguish, he made his choice and brought the axe down with all his might. Chapter 9, Temptation in the Dark. Wood chips flew as Ragnar's axe cleaved into the chapel altar, ancient, dried timber splitting under the force of his blow. He had made his choice to reject the pale stranger's temptation. Foolish boy, the dark figure hissed, gliding swiftly toward Ragnar with claws outstretched. Ragnar wrenched his axe free and swung wildly, but his blow passed straight through the apparition, throwing him off balance. Pale stranger waved a hand, casting Ragnar back against the stone wall with a powerful blast of magic. You cannot resist your fate, the stranger rasped. The darkness will consume you. Ragnar pulled himself to his feet, muscles screaming in protest. This was a fight he could not win through strength alone. He raised his axe once more in defiance. I choose the light. Closing his eyes, Ragnar recited an old prayer to Odin he had learned as a child. The familiar words brought back memories of home and hearth, innocence not yet lost. He repeated the prayer over and over, shutting out the pale stranger's taunts. Finally, Ragnar felt a presence around him, gentle like a warm summer breeze, yet powerful all the same. The very air in the chapel shimmered with renewed light. Pale stranger shrieked in agony, writhing as if burned. This is your last chance, Dark One, Ragnar intoned. Flee now, or be purified by the light. The pale stranger snarled curses, but retreated into the shadows. Ragnar kept chanting prayers, feeling the light grow ever stronger, banishing the darkness. With a last unearthly howl, the stranger vanished fully. Ragnar sank to his knees in exhaustion. The darkness had receded, for now, but it would never leave him completely. From here, only Ragnar's strength of will could keep it at bay. Stepping outside, Ragnar watched the first rays of dawn break over the snow-capped pines. The coming days would test him greatly, but as long as he held fast to the light in his heart, he would not falter again. Gripping his axe tightly, Ragnar set off down the mountain path towards a new day. Chapter 10, The Compassionate Path. Ragnar trudged along the forest trail, axe slung across his back. It had been weeks since his encounter with the pale stranger, but the memory still haunted him. Though he had resisted the darkness this time, the temptation would always be there. Rounding a bend, Ragnar spotted a young girl kneeling by the roadside, sobbing over a broken wagon wheel. Her parents futilely tried leveraging the heavy cart out of the muddy rut it was lodged in. Ragnar approached cautiously, not wishing to alarm them. Let me help you with that, he offered gently. The father looked at Ragnar's imposing frame warily. but nodded. With grunts of exertion, the two men dislodged the stubborn wheel while the mother comforted her frightened daughter. Once back on the path, the father clasped Ragnar's arm. "Thank you for your kindness, friend." The little girl even hugged Ragnar before they continued their journey. Ragnar stood watching as the family disappeared down the winding road. A smile tugged at his lips. This was a new path, using his strength to help others. If he focused on light instead of darkness, he could still make a difference in this world. In the next village Ragnar passed through, he volunteered his skills, mending roofs and chopping firewood for the poor and elderly. The work humbled Ragnar, but also brought a sense of peace. By serving humanity, he atoned for the blood spilled in his past. But Ragnar knew the real test still awaited. His dreams remained haunted by visions of the Draugr, beckoning him. One bleak night, when the wind howled through the trees like a wolf pack, Ragnar heard a different call, a distant scream. Rushing towards the sound, Ragnar discovered a farmstead under assault by a band of cutthroats. His blood boiled at the slaughter, but he hesitated. Could he confront such evil without losing himself to darkness? The screams made his decision. Ragnar charged, roaring into battle once more. Panting, Ragnar stared down at the bandit corpses littering the snow. He waited for the bloodlust to grip him again. But it did not come. Ragnar had slain evil, but from a place of light. With that knowledge, he turned and walked away through the swirling snow. Chapter 11. Hunters and Prey. Ragnar sat whittling a chunk of wood into an animal figurine for a sick child he had met in the last village. Focusing on such small acts of kindness helped keep the darkness at bay. But it was always lurking within, seeking any weakness. A snapping branch disrupted Ragnar's work. He glanced up to see a hulking mercenary emerge from the trees, sword drawn. "The bounty on your head will buy me a lot of ale," the man growled. Ragnar slowly sat down, his whittling, and grasped his axe. He had avoided combat since defeating the bandits, but it seemed violence would always track him down. "Leave now, friend. I wish you no harm," the mercenary spat. "The name's Ulf, not friend. And I aim to take you in, willing or not." He charged with a reckless overhead swing. Sighing, Ragnar sidestepped the blow and disarmed Ulf with practiced ease, kicking the sword away. But Ulf produced a dagger from his belt and attacked viciously. Ragnar soon sported several bleeding gashes. As Ulf drove Ragnar back against a gnarled oak, rage kindled within him. The familiar bloodlust, how easy it would be to unleash it and end this fight. Ragnar trembled with the effort of holding back the darkness. Then an idea came to him. Dropping his axe, Ragnar rushed forward and enveloped Ulf in a crushing bear hug. The mercenary struggled violently, slashing with his dagger, but Ragnar held firm. Slowly, the fury drained from Ulf. Ragnar began speaking soothing words until Ulf finally ceased his attack. Releasing the exhausted man, Ragnar retrieved some bandages and dressed Ulf's own wounds. "No more fighting," Ragnar urged, handing Ulf a skin of water. "Go, find a better path." Ulf glared resentfully, but gulped the water down. Gathering up his fallen sword, Ulf turned and stumbled off into the woods. Ragnar watched him go, then exhaled deeply. There were always alternatives to violence for those willing to find them. Stowing his axe, Ragnar returned to his humble camp. He still had much to atone for, many internal battles left to fight. But he would face them as he had Ulf today, with compassion, not brutality. With that silent vow, Ragnar picked up his half-finished wood carving and set calmly back to work. Chapter 12. The Long Road Home. Ragnar walked the empty forest path, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. Months had passed since he rejected the darkness and found a new way forward, guided by the light. But he could not shake the growing feeling that his work here was approaching its end. The last village he passed through had no sick to heal or elderly to aid. They only looked upon Ragnar with suspicion and fear once they learned his name. His legend had spread too far. It was time to move on. As Ragnar hiked over rolling hills dotted with newly blossoming trees, his thoughts turned north, back to the Viking settlement he had called home. Perhaps it was time to return, to use his gifts helping rebuild what was lost, if they would have him. Drawing nearer to the village, after many days' travel, Ragnar was struck by the bustle of activity. The Viking settlement had been restored far beyond what he remembered, but the faces of those working the fields and newly built longhouses were not all familiar. Wary eyes followed Ragnar as he made his way to the village square. Before he could call out a greeting, the village chief approached. "Ragnar, the redeemed, you are not welcome here." Ragnar looked stricken. "But this is my home." "Was your home?" the chief corrected sternly. "We know of your crimes and your devilry." He gestured to guards. "Leave now by your own choice, or we shall force you out." Ragnar opened his mouth to argue, but saw the truth on their faces. This was no longer a place he could live in peace. Bowing his head in acceptance, Ragnar turned and walked away without a word. As Ragnar passed the outskirts of town, a voice called out, "Wait." He turned to see a young girl running up to press something into his hand, a carving of a bear he had gifted her months ago. "Don't forget who you really are," she said, eyes brimming with tears. Before Ragnar could respond, she turned and disappeared back into the village. Ragnar studied the small carving and felt the faint glimmer of hope reignite inside. Pocketing the bear, he set off once more. The road stretched endlessly onward, but as long as kindness yet remained in this world, Ragnar would follow it.
Hey everyone, before we dive into today's stories, let's set an ambitious goal. Can we hit 200 likes on this video? Smashing that like button not only supports the channel, but it also helps us bring more stories your way. So go ahead, tap that like button, and let's make it happen. Chapter 1. Into the Unknown. You gotta understand, I weren't always some kind of reckless adventurer chasing that high you get from pitting yourself against the wilderness. I know folks see me that way now, what with all the magazines and television spots since I got some fame telling my tale. But before that cursed trek into the deep woods, I was just ordinary Jake Sawyer, working a 9-to-5 pushing papers at Stanton Insurance. But the wilderness was in my blood from boyhood. I guess you could say I felt the call, same as old Grey Cloud told me his ancestors did. That ancient itch to strike out alone, leave civilization behind, test yourself against Mother Nature on her home turf. The woods were my siren, and the monotonous gray drudgery of my city life the rocks they threatened to dash me upon. Maybe half the trouble that found me out there was my own stubborn fault, for forcing a showdown between worlds. When I scored 2 weeks vacation time at the agency, clearing some dead wood off the ledgers faster than old Higgins expected, that siren's call in my ears became a roar I could no longer ignore. I emptied out every backpacking supply shop in town, told myself it was just a hobby, a way to burn off work stress. But even then, I think a darker part of me knew what I planned. Knew I wouldn't be satisfied traipsing up and down some tame trails other tourists left beaten down for me. Now I wanted it raw, wild. Just me versus the ancient predators that prowl places not meant for man. And we all know how that turned out. But still, I at least prepared as well as any greenhorn could. I read every book on wilderness survival, edible plants, and orienteering. Saved up a mighty chunk of change for professional gear to survive weeks off-grid. Made myself strong and lean. ready for the ultimate endurance test. And by God, if the day I loaded up my new 26-liter rucksack and hit the trail didn't feel like I had the whole untamed earth laid out before me. Now don't go thinking I was outright suicidal, just itching to disappear. I told my ma and girlfriend Stacy I was going camping at Rattlesnake Hill, left the ranger station my intended route and return date. Had reserves of food and emergency packs that would keep me safe and healthy, even if it took me a spell to adjust out there. But in my secret heart, I hoped it'd take me a lot more than a spell to find my way back again. Hoped I could screw my courage to the sticking point and finally listen to that call. Just me, the boundless forest, and whatever mysteries waited off the paths well-trod. Oh, I heard the ranger's well-meaning warnings all right, about solo hikers gone missing and how the deep woods can fool your senses, make you lose your way inside yourself. But like any cocky young buck, I puffed up my chest and said I weren't scared of nothing, I'd be fine. If only I knew those haunted trees were already watching me, swaying and murmuring, laughing at the lie of safety I cloaked myself in. You ask old Grey Cloud, he'll say the wild gods chose me out special from the start. But choose for what exactly? Salvation or sacrifice? That's the real question. One I reckon I'll be figuring out the rest of my born days. All I know is once you've locked eyes with the darkness in its hidden heart, it changes a man forevermore. The wild leaves its mark on your spirit, good and permanent. And them quiet trees, they knew it. Knew I'd already wandered too far from concrete and streetlights before I ever took the first step along that fateful trail into the unknown. Some doors, once you pass on through, ain't no going back till you face down the ancient evils lurking ahead. Chapter 2, where the trail ends. That first day in the woods passed about as perfect as I could have dreamed. Blue skies, clean air, dappled sunlight teasing through the pines above. I was deep enough to leave the day hikers behind, but still recognizably on the marked trail, following them friendly painted blazes from tree to tree like breadcrumbs through the brush. It was round noon when I stopped to brew up some instant soup and take in the sights. I'd been walking since dawn, mostly uphill with a 40-pound pack, so I was bushed. But it was a good tired, the kind that reminds you you're alive. The trees here were ancient, towering giants that made me feel small, but in a proper way. Like a pilgrim standing in the nave of some huge cathedral, gazing upward. I drank in the solitude like a healing tonic, leaning back on a boulder worn smooth by uncounted years of rain and snowmelt. Eyes closed, I could almost feel the forest breathing around me, the roots sunk deep into soil and time itself. The shush of wind through the pines was a soothing hymn, sung special just for me. I lingered there a while, just emptying my mind and letting the wild speak without forcing meaning on it. You grow up today with TV and cars and computers blinking everywhere. You forget the world once talked in a different tongue, the language of water over stone, of each critter following the singing of its own small spirit. If you get real still, real quiet of the soul, you can catch whispers in that oldest dialect again. But move, rush, live impatient like we do. It fades to static in your head. That's why I had to go pilgriming to these far woods. I realize that now. Hoping somehow to tune back into the song I was losing under fluorescent office lights and the ding of cash registers. As if finding that harmony again could heal some broke piece of me I couldn't even properly name. When I shouldered up my pack again and got walking, I felt lighter somehow. Like a layer of grime civilization paints on you got scrubbed away by the forest air. My boots moved quiet as any doe through the ruby pine needles and gray-green ferns. The plastic blaze ties seemed almost an offense now. I had half a notion just to leave the trail for good, abandon the last ties and really let the woods swallow me whole. Become just a shaggy wild man, like old Dionysus wandering the mountainside. But eventually I thought better of such radical notions and decided to camp come sunset on the trail like I planned. No use getting ahead of myself first day in. I could take little side jaunts exploring as the trip went on, working my way up to an off-trail solo night. Worst came to worst, my supplies would see me home soon enough. No room for recklessness. Right? Trouble was, when late afternoon crept over the woods and I looked about for a campsite, nothing suitable appeared near the path. And that fading blaze line seemed awful restrictive suddenly, like following it was just clinging to civilization's apron strings. Before I hardly knew I decided, I saw myself step off trail into the brush. Just a few minutes, I'd scout around and circle back, but in the chase of parting branches and the crunch of unseen stones underfoot, I forgot which way led back. The woods wrapped close around me like a shawl, subtly shifting to erase all trace of where I'd come from. That little voice of reason piped up as the light faded, saying I should try to find the trail again before full nightfall. But the trees, they whispered louder in the gathering gloom, whispered that I belonged to them now. That lost child had returned, so why seek the trail that would just return me to empty lies? Weren't no going back once the wild takes hold. The deeper I wandered, the louder sang those forest voices. The white blazes were well and swallowed behind me by then. And with my lamp lit against the dark, I couldn't help but feel watched from the black spaces between those ancient sentinels. Some primal instinct told me I weren't alone out there, no matter what I tried convincing myself. And the watchers maybe didn't take kindly to trespassers roaming wild under their boughs. Chapter 3. The First Glimpse. Trudging lost through rough country as the wheezing day died away was harrowing, no mistake. The forest at night ain't like the friendly sunlit trails. What was majestic turns gnarled and strange, full of whispers you strain to catch. The trees jostled close with their limbs outstretched. Needled fingers grasped for purchase as I ducked and stumbled blindly over rocks and pits. No matter how far I lumbered into the unfamiliar black, looking for I know not what, those craggy pines still hemmed me in on all sides. My thread of path was well broke. No picking up again. The woods had swallowed me down deep into its gullet. I could feel the digestive acids starting to churn already, breaking me down nice and slow. When exhaustion forced a rest, I lit a little fire with hands shaking near as bad as the time Stacy walked out for good. Not much, just enough to keep the eyes of the wild at bay. I tried comforting myself it would be a fine adventure come daylight, but the night sounds were queer, with odd shrieks and a raven's croaking laughter echoing weirdly close, like they had jokes at my expense waiting up their feathered sleeve. I kept my hunting knife close, whittling away at a stick to calm my jumping nerves. The repetition let my frazzled thoughts settle some. It was just one night lost off path, I reminded myself. All would be set right when the sun ascended, as it were ordained to do. I had to keep faith despite this test sent to try me. Keep my wits, so when clarity returned I'd be poised to seize it. As the wee hours crept near, weariness beat my anxiety back enough for fitful rest. But it was a porous sleep, rife with wrestles as the fire guttered down. Some primal sentinel in my brain kept one eye half-cocked for trouble coming from the night's fertile womb. It was slanted rays spearing through the black pines that woke me. But this was no dawn's first light. A direct beam landed hot on my face that had me bolt upright, casting around for the source. That's when the dreadful truth struck me full on. These rays came from no sun. They snaked between the mossy trunks, silent and purposeful, bobbing like will-o-wisps. But they did not flit and flutter. They moved in an odd way like they were prodding at the shivering man-thing on the forest floor below. I froze like a startled squirrel under that alien glare. 5 ghastly pale lights hung suspended, maybe 20 yards out at odd angles through the trees. They seemed to watch me, cautious but intensely curious, analyzing their prize foundling. My tongue turned wooden in my mouth. These were no swamp gases or distant headlights. They were something uncanny, deep beyond my experience. The zephyrs folded back as they drifted nearer, pressed down by a presence that had the fine hairs on my neck bolt upright. Every animal instinct screamed to run, to flee this unnatural sight. But I could not stir an inch. Even to breathe felt dangerous, like my lungs were on loan and liable to be recalled. So I crouched statue still, pulse jackhammering. The wisps hovered closer, intent seeming almost friendly. I felt my muscles loosening despite myself at their warm glow. A reflexive smile tugged my lips, wanting to trust, wanting to believe whatever strange creatures they were meant no harm. Surely they were simply fellow denizens of the woods drawn close to examine the curious two-legged that had wandered into their midst. We could coexist, couldn't we? Closer they drifted, their mesmerizing shine growing till it was near blending in the gloom. I raised a weak hand to shield my dazzled ease. Closer, closer still, near enough to touch. If only I could just reach out, make contact with whatever strange new life. But just before they embraced me, the lights vanished quick as a candle blown out. My vision throbbed purple and red with the afterglow as I gaped into sudden darkness. Only the soft creak of pines filled the void where unearthly radiance had pierced the night just moments before. Had I dreamt it all? I dared not believe it, even as morning birds erupted in mating calls heralding the dawn. Tried chalking the encounter up as a delusion bred by darkness and stress. But one bleak fact broke through my feeble denial. Out there in the wilds, I was no longer the solitary hunter. No, some forest entity was now hunting me. Chapter 4. Ancient Legends. Morning crept over the woods grudgingly, like it weren't keen to force those unearthly lights back to their slumber. Gray mist steamed up from the mossy earth, swallowing my little camp and leaving me marooned alone on an island peeking up from a roiling gloomy sea. Anything could hide in a pea soup fog like that. Anything at all. But daylight is daylight, and eventually the sun burned through to rout the mist in smoky tatters. I shook the cobwebs and heebie-jeebies out my head best I could and took stock of my situation. No food left save some crushed granola bars, and my canteen was bone dry. The situation was rapidly deteriorating from an adventure to an ordeal. Still, I stumbled onward, aiming to put distance between myself and whatever unnatural doings occurred under the deceptive stars. The woods remained unnervingly silent as I blundered through brambles that tore at my clothes and scored my skin red. Not one bird cried out nor rodent skittered. There was only me, my drumming heart, and the muted thump of my boots over soft earth. Until a new sound arose ahead. Voices. I loped desperate toward that blessed human chatter like a castaway spotting a distant sail. Bursting into a little clearing, I spied two ramshackle buildings, the first signs of civilization since I departed the trailhead. Hope leapt up in me as I staggered into the dusty hamlet like a half-drowned sailor dragged from the surf. The voices cut off sharply at my loud arrival. An ancient pickup squeaked in protest as the doors were flung open. Two figures stepped out, eyeing me warily. The elder gent kept his gnarled hand rested casual-like on a shotgun propped against the truck's grill. Wouldn't blame him for being cautious about wild-eyed strangers lurching out of nowhere. I raised my palms slowly to show I meant no ill intent. "Pardon the intrusion," I rasped. My throat was parched as month-old jerky. But I seemed to have gotten myself, well, a mite lost in the woods nearby. If you could just point me toward the nearest trail or ranger station, I'd be much obliged. The old man peered at me a spell, bushy eyebrows drawn together. Then he broke into a gap-toothed smile that crinkled his leathery skin good-naturedly. "Reckon you did get yourself turned round out here," he chuckled. "Ain't no marked trails for 50 miles or more in any direction. You're about deep as it gets." He strode forward and clapped me hard on the shoulder. "Come on, then. Have some stew. Name's Gray Cloud, and this here's my grandson, Tanner. We don't get many visitors to these parts." Over hearty squirrel stew by the fire, Gray Cloud explained they were descendants of the Nimiipu, but he preferred living solitary off the land to any modern reservation. The first peoples had dwelt in harmony with these woods for centuries untold. But even Gray Cloud's people feared the strange lights that plagued this region sometimes. "Will-o-wisps, we call them," he said, face turning solemn as the fire cast deep shadows from the crags of his face. "Malevolent spirits, or so legend says. They lead folks astray, make 'em wander the woods lost till they die of starvation or madness." I swallowed hard. No way was it chance he mentioned those exact phenomena that drove me blindly to his door. Sensing my unease, Grey Cloud leaned forward, black eyes reflecting the flames. "You seen them wisps, ain't you? Out there in the dark?" I nodded once, reluctant to voice it aloud lest such talk conjure those phantoms back to lurking. The old man sighed and threw another log on the fire. "Thought as much. Don't you fret. We'll keep them scoundrels at bay. You're under my protection here." His steadying hand on my shoulder wrenched me back from the brink I teetered on. Outside, the woods pressed close, but in here was refuge. Sanctuary from whatever unnatural forces dogged my trail. At least long enough to get my wits back about me and make a plan. Because wandering witless and hounded by haints was a fine way to lose yourself, body and soul. And what good would my fancy education and gear do then? None at all. I needed old Grey Cloud's wisdom to steer me through this trial unscathed. Through the ancient darkness that prowled outside. The darkness now awoken and fixed upon me with grim purpose. Chapter 5. The Story of the Wisps. Hunkering by Grey Cloud's fire, I felt cleaved in two. Part of me thrilled hearing tell of those eerie wisps and the profound mysteries of this untamed land. But the more sensible part quailed knowing those phantoms had their sights fixed on me, their prey. I had strayed where I ought not, and now a reckoning was at hand, as old as the pines themselves. I asked Grey Cloud what provoked the wisps to start haunting these woods and leading folks astray. He stared into the flickering flames, his craggy features set grim as he summoned the tragic tale from memory. Back during the gold rush days, 24 miners got lost up here in the dead of winter. Half crazed with visions of wealth, he began. A freak blizzard trapped them, buried their camp under drifts 20 feet deep. The wind picked up outside as if echoing his tale, driving smoke down the chimney and stinging my eyes. I shuffled closer to the fire's warmth and safety. Snow blinded them, buried their gear and cattle both. For shelter, they stumbled into the old cave system riddling these valleys. In desperation, they went deeper, seeking escape from the storm's fury. Grey Cloud's face was bleak in the fireglow, but the hunger and cold slowly took them all in the end. Some resorted to dark acts, trying to survive. They say the screams of pain and rage as that forsaken group dwindled still echo in those caverns on cold nights when the moon is hid. I shuddered, glancing involuntarily toward the black woods outside. A scream would not surprise me, though the trees stood mute and patient in the storm's breath. "Some curse must linger here from the horrors that played out underground," Grey Cloud murmured. "The spirits of those abandoned miners still haunt these valleys, envying the living. The wisps are their way of luring in fresh souls to join their torment." He eyed me squarely, his words heavy as millstones. "You stirred that vengeance up by trespassing deep here. Led them back from the shadows, hungry for the warmth you carry. Light doesn't survive long swallowed by darkness, not without sacrifices made." I stared, chilling truth sinking into my bones like winter's frost. My arrogance had awakened an ancient grudge, and a ghostly jury waited to exact their due. But I'd not surrender to madness or death without a fight. Outside, the trees creaked and groaned under the rising wind. The wisps were out there still, watching and waiting. Chapter 6. The Growing Threat. I lingered under Grey Cloud's roof for a while, regaining my strength while the blizzard raged itself out. The old man fed me well and shared sage advice for navigating the wrinkled land, reading nature's secret signs. His charms and talismans kept the lurking wisps at bay temporarily, but we both felt their patience fraying as my departure drew near. On the third morning, I woke to a pale sun streaming through the frosted window panes. The storm had blown itself clean. Time for this prodigal son to continue his journey, though my nerves jangled like a telegraph at the prospect. Grey Cloud pressed one last humble bundle on me as I strapped up my gear. Mountain ash, St. John's wort, and Rowan charms to ward away bad medicine, he said, eyes solemn as the grave. Keep 'em close. The wisps have caught your scent now. I stowed the life-saving talismans and embraced Grey Cloud in mute gratitude. Then I struck out alone into the snow-blanketed valley, picking over wind-felled timber and boulder fields. The ravens watched my progress from bare branches, peering down with inscrutable jet eyes. I spoke soft prayers under my breath, invoking any godly force that might guide me from this condemned tract. But as dusk spread its fan, dread pooled in my gut. The ghostly lights would be rising, emerging from whatever unholy altar stones or accursed grottos concealed them by day. I quickened my pace, desperate for distance and shelter. But wherever I roamed, the woods rearranged themselves, subtly misleading my path. Soon darkness took me, and I could only stumble on blind and helpless, no handhold left in the material world. When my shin cracked against a fallen fir, I sprawled face first into the snow. As I lay there groaning, the cold seeped through my clothes, sapping will and strength. Why not just lay here and drift to sleep? The woods would surely recover my tired husk come spring thaw. A branch cracked, jerking me back. I rolled over to glimpse against the indigo sky the dangling corpse of a hanged man, bloated tongue lolling. I screamed hoarse, scuttling back like a crab from the awful vision. But it did not pursue me. Just hung swaying from that twisted pine bough, neckties flapping in the breath of no earthly breeze. A grim portent of my fate. Near crazed with fatigue and fear, I ran reckless and blind. But the phantom followed, always at the corner of my sight, beseeching with its bulging citrine eyes for me to embrace a like end. To give myself unto the forest that called my name in gray cloud's voice now, coaxing me into the dark. When my legs gave out, I crawled whimpering into the lee of a boulder, drawing charms around me in a crude ring. And none too soon, the telltale glow of wisps arose, wicked as foxfire. They swirled at the edge of the warding circle, searching for a crack to exploit. Their probe promised madness if they breached my frail defenses, but the charms held, thanks to gray cloud's medicine. At dawn, the wisps retreated once more to their shadowed haunts with a sound like chattering teeth, frustrated for now. Yet they would return with the dark, and my strength was flagging. This nightly ordeal could only end one way unless I found deliverance back to the world beyond these accursed reaches. Each rising of the pale watchers saw my hope further diminished. It was surely only a matter of time before they pulled me under into the deep places where the lost ones dwell. Chapter 7. A Glimpse of Evil. I scrabbled desperately over that wrinkled land. No longer caring, I tore clothes and hide scraping against granite and pine until blood ran. Anything to keep moving away from the haunted vales where wisps danced nightly. But the woods only drove me in widening circles. The sun spinning mad above the trees, marking no progress. That shriveling rind of sanity remaining knew I could not evade the wisps' hounding forever. Each night they circled closer around my fireless camps, the chanting force of their combined malign will battering my thoughts. Soon they would breach my waning defenses to scry the secrets of my mind, unmake me from within. So when the gloaming deepened on the fifth night, if my fraying sense of time held true, I determined to make my stand, salvage some last shreds of defiance. I strode to the center of a moon-dappled glade and stood awaiting the encounter that would decide my fate, for ill or worse. The usual chorus of whispers and half-heard cries arising from the rotten hollows foretold the wisp's arrival. Queer mist seeped from bowls and burrows as the air turned deathly still, so no leaf shivered. The hateful things approached reveling in my throbbing dread. But as their unholy glow limned the glade, a new sound shuddered the silence. A stone's throw-off drifted something squelching through moldering mulch and muck. Though near blind with terror as the noises circled behind me, I forced my rigid neck to turn and confront this fresh horror. The breath stilled bitter in my lungs. Shambling on all fours from the bracken stood a thing not natural nor hale. It was gaunt and hunched with skin pale as maggot meat, white hair hanging in greasy ropes. But its eyes burned feverish and cunning above a mouth wet with drool. The repulsive creature's limbs moved in ways no joints should allow, clicking and twitching like a tarantula. It paused to inspect me with unabashed hunger, tongue lashing out obscene over misshapen teeth. Revulsion choked me at its rank stench, the grave's cold breath. The wisps chittering rose in fury at the monster's presence. Their wrathful shine flashed and flared erratically, but they kept their distance, seeming to loathe to approach nearer. Sizing this new opponent up with cowardice or respect, those cunning feral eyes latched onto mine, and a croaking, unused voice rasped hollow from its desiccated maw. Pretty tender morsel, lost and far from home. It grinned wetly, ropes of saliva stretching between yellowed fangs. Old Snickersnack will gnaw your bones clean. I backpedaled in mindless horror from the unhinged promises as the fiend stalk crawled steadily closer on its elongated arms. The wisp's keening wails felt distant, overpowered by the blood-rushing panic in my ears. I turned to flee that foul brute and its vile blandishments, but my boots slid out from under me in the damp leaves, sending me crashing earthward. I glimpsed the monster looming above before all went black, its talons grasping down as consciousness fled. But just before oblivion claimed me, it seemed childlike. Piping laughter echoed from afar at my sorry plight. Chapter 8. The Cave Discovery. Consciousness returned reluctantly to my pounding skull, bringing memory of that awful misshapen beast and its greedy hands grasping for my prone form. I jolted alert and flailed upright, certain to find those jagged talons sunken into my soft limbs. But no creature crouched waiting nearby, only still and silent pines standing sentinel around the tiny hollow where I lay. The memory of that gaunt horror felt like a hag's curse, so vivid and choking, yet evaporated like dawn mist under the revealing sun. I rubbed at the knot on my temple and tried taking stock. My compass and provisions were still intact in my pack, by some small mercy. And judging by the sun between swaying boughs, I had not been senseless more than a few hours. Yet unease lingered. Was that ghoul merely a wisp-bred vision? Or did it yet lurk in a wooded gloom nearby, awaiting my unguarded throat? I shuddered at the thought and shouldered my pack, resolved to put distance between myself and the creature's woodland haunts. But I chose my path poorly, for my boots soon met only empty air where solid ground should be. I tumbled graceless down a hidden sinkhole with a ragged cry. Cursing my clumsiness, I assessed for injuries once the world stopped spinning. I had fallen into some cave or mine shaft, the rough rock walls disappearing into darkness on all sides. But all seemed sound enough, by miracle of fortune. With tender care I stood, bracing for any broken bones or gushing blood. When none manifested, I exhaled in relief. Only ubiquitous bruises then. Another narrow escape. Escape. The word echoed, taunting in my addled thoughts. Had I escaped the lurking fiend above, only to leap into some fresh pitfall? The stifling gloom hinted this hole delved deep into the wooded hills, a perfect lair for subterranean denizens. I did not wish to meet whatever lived in these sunless depths. I scoured the rock walls for handholds to climb my way back above ground. But the sinkhole yawned twice the height of any man. My escape as marooned as ever. I'd have to follow the tunnel leading away, pray it connected to the surface further on. The darkness was absolute, forcing me to creep one hesitant step at a time. But gradually, a faint glow arose ahead. I hurried forward, desperate for light, only to pull up short in renewed awe and dread. The tunnel opened into a vast cavern, faintly illuminated by clusters of enormous glowing mushrooms. Their bioluminescent stems and caps provided an eerie green glow by which to view the disturbing contents. Scattered across the space were ratty bedrolls, picks, and other rusted tools. And most unsettling of all, primitive paintings spread over every rock surface. Crude depictions of stick-like hunters chasing animals covered the walls. I peered closer at one cluster of artwork and recoiled. The animals the tiny hunters pursued had too many limbs. Some paintings clearly showed people being dragged underground by the spider-limbed monstrosities. A cave-in of rubble partially blocked the far end of the cavern, cutting off any easy exit. But as I crunched hesitantly over the gritty floor, seeking another way out, the remnants told their grim tale. A collapsed tunnel, tools meant for excavating. This had been a mining camp for the poor souls Gray Cloud spoke of, trapped by snow in these lightless caverns so long ago. In desperation, they had dug deeper, either unaware or uncaring that they dug towards some unhallowed domain. In the end, they unearthed far more than mere gold or gemstones. I knew then the sinkhole was no mishap, but the work of a guiding will. Something lurked down here still, something that remembered the miners' trespass. And it was showing me these grim artifacts as a warning. This was a place of the dead. Any who intruded would join their number, a feast for the endless dark. I stumbled away from the horrific wall etchings, mind recoiling. But there was nowhere to flee, no sanctuary from the secrets this buried place held. Limits had been breached, powers unleashed from below eons ago. Powers that yet lingered, reaching up through the earth's cracks for unwary prey. Their hour approached, and their lamb wandered straight to slaughter. Chapter 9. Stalked underground. I scrambled reckless through those tunnels with their ominous past. Stray rocks skittered under my boots, dashed into the hungry dark by their terrified wearer. Anything to outrun the gruesome fates etched upon the cavern walls in childlike pigments. But the deeper I delved toward where the mine collapsed, the thicker clung the chill damp air. No wholesome wind stirred these dead reaches. There was only the soft, steady plink of water, and the hushed weight of tons of stone ever poised to collapse if their strange foundations shifted. When the tunnels branched, I followed the path of disturbed debris, drag marks, scattered tools, even shards of bone glinting accusingly. These scant breadcrumbs led on through the labyrinth, toward the grisly revelations waiting at its heart. The ghostly miners long dead kept pace with my flight. I glimpsed their gaunt shadows capering in my periphery, just outside the view of my lantern's jittering beam. Their whispers echoed distorted down side passages, always at my heel. A wordless susurration of madness and agony that eroded all thought of daylight. Was there ever truly a world above, where birds sang and rivers ran clean? Or had I only dreamt such fantasies before awakening to stone and endless night? I forged on deliriously through the mental assault, no longer heeding the paths I took. But the ghosts kept herding me, driving their lost lamb onward. I was too scared to understand that I was moving steadily downward, the tunnels angling ever deeper toward some waiting doom. Until the malefic chanting ceased abruptly, the phantom's urging gone. My lantern dimmed to a sickly glow, revealing a final cavern, more vast than any prior. I stood transfixed, like a fly caught hopeless in some sadistic spider's web. For across the space, lit by spectral foxfire blooms, hulked the twisted form of the creature I had glimpsed above. It crouched regarding me, limbs splayed grotesque. A lifeless pallor hung about it, as of something deprived of the sun's blessed touch so long it forgot its nourishing kiss. When the thing shuffled closer, disturbing no dust, dread clutched me that its feet no longer walked terrestrial ground. Snicker-snack hungry, it rasped, ropey tongue lashing over cracked lips, leaving a viscous sheen. Tender quicklings who wriggle and run, nibbling away. It gnashed its elongated teeth, expelling a charnel stench. But rather than lunge and feed, it drew back, sizing me up with cunning. A spine-tingling giggle escaped its maw. Old Snicker-snack not greedy, it crooned, reaching with a gnarled appendage. We share meat and secrets, yes. You show me yours and I show you mine. It cackled again at some obscene joke only it understood. Revulsion clenched my gut, but looking upon that dreadful parody of nature, I knew only a kernel of humanity yet clung to this debased monster. In its sunken eyes I glimpsed the man it had been, before cruel fates and desperation transformed him to abhorrent shapes in the dark. You were one of the lost miners, I ventured, voice quavering. But you survived down here somehow. You don't have to lure people to their death anymore. I can help you find redemption. A yawning silence met my entreaty. For a moment I feared I had provoked its savage side. But then it spoke with unexpected gentleness. "No help for old Snickersnack," it sighed. "Just sleep. Lovely sleep. You will join me there." It lunged with viper speed before I could scream. Icy tendrils plunged into the soft tissues of my exposed neck before withdrawing again. The chill of creeping death spread down my limbs, paralyzing muscles and seizing breath. I collapsed limp beneath the creature's blank-eyed regard as ravenous shadows gathered at the edges of my stolen sight. As the last stubborn sparks of consciousness guttered out, it crouched over me, appraising my slack face with detached interest. Darkness took me under to the sound of childlike lips smacking greedily in anticipation of the coming feast. Down into the deep tomb womb of the earth to join the remnants of the doomed expedition that stumbled here so long ago. There would be no waking now. Only the quenching silence, and the mole-soft dirge of burrowing things in the benighted tunnels deep below. Chapter 10. The Creature Revealed. That final glimpse of the pale ghoul leaning hungrily over my paralyzed body flickered brief as a candle before the endless night rushed over me. But instead of oblivion, a jumble of frenzied images and sounds catapulted through my senses. I witnessed the poor snowbound souls from Grandpa Cloud's tail stumbling through white-out gusts into the cave's deceiving shelter. Later, I saw them huddled round their dimming fire in the mine shaft, faces turning savage from hunger. I heard their dejected whispers in the dark give way to rabid snarls as they turned on each other in confinement. Gunshots rang out, frantic footsteps scrambled in the blackness, pursued by inhuman howls of the dying, until only the creature was left to prowl those abandoned tunnels. But the grim history lesson faded as a far gentler scene arose. A modest cabin in the woods at dusk. A mother called 2 grubby boys inside for supper, her voice warm with love. The younger child's muddy face beamed up in simply joy that cut through the surrounding gloom. The vision shifted, and I now peered from behind that same boy's eyes as he embraced his crying sibling in the mine tunnel. His hand gripped tight around a bloody hunting knife. Their faces were hollow-cheeked, their eyes full of animal fear. But the brother clung fiercely to that last flicker of humanity, love enduring despite the lengthening shadows. I awoke with a gasp in the creature's gloomy chamber. Tears wet my cheeks from the tragic glimpse into its lost innocence. But I could not linger on sorrow. The thing crouched mere feet away, observing me curiously. It had not expected its prey to stir again, yet no fury marred its sunken features. Gathering my courage, I spoke with quiet empathy. "You were just a child when you entered these mines with your family, weren't you? I know you've suffered unimaginable pain. But there are still glimmers of light even in the deepest pits." The creature flinched at my words, spindly limbs contracting in distress. Then it loosed a desolate moan like the caverns themselves were cracking. "No more light, only hunger. It gnaws and gnaws, never leaving Snickersnack be." Pity welled in me for the ageless trauma this lost soul had endured in the fruitless quest to appease that insatiable yearning. But I knew any scrap of light, once found, could sustain a spirit even through the blackest night. "There is a way back from the dark paths you've trod," I maintained, "if we seek redemption together." The creature gazed at me, and for the first time its eyes held a glimmer of hope instead of crazed despair. It nodded, then slumped wearily as if the exchange had sapped its energy. "Help old Snickersnack end the hunger," it rasped, before scuttling into a shadowed crevice. I sat stunned, scarcely believing the mercy I had been shown spared me from becoming this tormented being's next subterranean feast. But the more sobering revelation was that even in the face of ravenous madness, some innate goodness may yet abide in a soul, needing only the light of compassion to coax it forth. Escaping from the caverns could wait. My priorities now were bringing that crucial light down into this sunless void, and helping the creature reclaim its lost humanity before the last flickers faded to cold and endless dark. Our path would be fraught with setbacks and success not assured. But I knew my fate was intertwined now with the tormented miner's child who had lingered here so long beyond hope. If redemption proved impossible, then we would walk at least a short while together in the struggle toward grace. Sometimes the light requires us to abandon all thoughts of escape and simply remain present with suffering in its darkest abodes. For even the faintest glimmer can reveal the subtle winding back toward dawn. If one keeps faith through the long night. Chapter 11. A Necessary Sacrifice. I lingered in the glowing fungus grottos for a time, keeping grim company with the wretched creature. Old Snickersnack, as it ruefully dubbed itself. We shared meager rations, it favoring the blind pale salamanders and larvae wriggling in the cracks. I attempted basic speech with it, though its replies wavered between infancy and derangement. Still, a tenderness was growing between us, ironically akin to the bond of those orphaned brothers in older, happier times. Not every exchange need be sensible to offer companionship in the dark, but the claustrophobia of endless tunnels and tons of stone ever-threatening collapse slowly eroded my spirit. I yearned for the sky, for the woods and the wisps that had once seemed so fell. The caverns were the creature's sanctuary, but they whispered only slow death to me. I knew the time approached when I must continue my grim pilgrimage back toward light. When I broke the news of my imminent departure, Snickersnack let out a desolate moan like a death rattle. I soothed its fretting best I could, swore I would return once I secured aid and supplies to sustain us both above ground. But its agitated mutterings told me it expected only betrayal. My heart weighed heavy, for I knew not what wrenches this necessary separation would work upon its tormented mind. But I could waste away here no longer. On the icy morning of my exodus, I presented a humble parting gift to the hunched rag-clad form who watched my preparations with rheumy eyes. A charcoal rendering of two boys fishing a sun-dappled stream, faces aglow with youth. A precious memory once buried under decades of unlight. Snickersnack cradled it gently in his warped claws, great tears splashing the page. Looking upon that shining young face from its own warped visage seemed to stir some ghost of better nature. It nodded once in solemn understanding. Thus, freed from the greater part of my guilt, I ascended with shuddering limbs through the tunnels toward the surface ordeal awaiting me. The remains of the lost expedition lay undisturbed now in the monster's lair. Somehow in death they had been granted a measure of penance. While their squalling spirits yet roamed the caverns, their bones would rest until I fulfilled my vow. My joy was near delirious, breaking through at last to pine-scented air and birdsong. Though the miles homeward stretched long and harsh with scarce supplies, I laughed aloud simply beholding dawn's pink palette break over the rugged horizon. But the weary glee drained swift as I took stock of my bearings. For in my days below ground, the woods had reshaped themselves into an intricate labyrinth. I recognized none of the surrounding slopes and ravines. There was no worn path for my feet, only endless leagues of defiant granite and towering redwoods awaiting my irresolute tread. The trees stood ossified in judgment, a jury row convened to weigh my crimes trespassing upon their domain. Their wordless whispers spoke clearer than any town gossip. Coward, the firs accused, their needles hissing. Oath-breaker, he's left the lost one to the dark and cold below. The pines and cedars bowed outraged before this travesty of conscience. I bore the trees' scorn as I navigated their unfamiliar land, for it echoed my own churning guilt. I had abandoned Snickersnack to the horrors that warped its flesh. My treacherous departure could push the creature beyond recovery, when kindness had just begun seeping through the cracks of its madness. Unless I gave more than mere parting kindness. More than transient days of companionship in the dark. I stopped short in a barren gulch, blood draining from my face as the solution became clear, an act of self-rending redemption. The only possible atonement was through a gift of my very living tissue to sustain the creature's torment and bring peace. My crimes against it could warrant no lesser recompense. I traced the hunting knife in my pack, breath coming tight. But there was no other way forward now. What use were two strong legs if they merely carried me further from truth? With grim purpose, I honed the blade in anticipation of excising my pound of flesh, binding back the blood flow, and hobbling onward. I would need strength for the grueling return trip down into the lightless belly of the caverns, where the Nameless One awaited me, ready at last to feast on the warm communion I offered, and thus seal our covenant beyond parting. For such rituals cut both ways. The bringer of the gift must sacrifice, suffer, and surrender all, so that their redemption becomes one. I prayed that old Snicker-Snack would find this sufficient to satisfy its hunger until I secured proper aid from above. For we walked as kin now, and I would let no further harm tarnish it, though this pilgrim's progress took me crawl by crawl through the bloody dark. Well, that's it, folks. I really hoped you enjoyed this story and it didn't scare you too much. If you're enjoying these spine-tingling tales and want to dive even deeper into the world of suspense and horror, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. By subscribing, you'll be the first to hear our latest eerie stories and embark on thrilling audio journeys with us. Don't miss out on a single shiver or chill. Subscribe now and become part of our ever-growing community of horror enthusiasts. Hey everyone, before we dive into today's stories, let's set an ambitious goal. Can we hit 200 likes on this video? Smashing that like button not only supports the channel, but it also helps us bring more stories your way. So go ahead, tap that like button, and let's make it happen.
Lost in the woods. Want to get away this weekend? I asked my boyfriend Seth. We could go camping up near Mount Baker. He frowned at the trail map spread across our coffee table. I don't know, babe. Looks pretty remote. Maybe we should start with something easier for our first backpacking trip. Come on, it'll be an adventure, I pleaded. Look, it's only 10 miles to get to this campground by Bear Lake. We just follow the trail the whole way. Nice and easy. Seth still seemed uncertain, so I kissed his cheek. I'll make it worth the hike, I whispered. That made him crack a smile. Well, in that case, how can I say no? A night under the stars with you does sound pretty perfect. I grinned, thrilled to have won him over. We spent the week gearing up with supplies and packing our camping gear. The sunny June weather had me giddy with excitement for our first big trip together. Early Saturday morning, we laced up our hiking boots and hit the trail. Surrounded by the lush greenery and fresh air, my stress melted away. With our backpacks loaded up and trail maps at the ready, we felt ready for anything. After a few miles, we stopped at a clearing to eat lunch. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. Good call convincing me to do this, Seth said between bites of his sandwich. Definitely beats sitting at home this weekend. Told you it would be worth it, I said. We soaked in the idyllic setting for a bit before continuing our hike, spirits high. But as the day wore on, the terrain grew steeper and more rugged. Seth started lagging behind, sweat dripping from his brow. How much farther now? He asked, pausing to take another swig of water. I checked the map and frowned. Looks like we still have about 5 miles left. Glancing up at the darkening sky, I felt a prickle of doubt. Want to set up camp here for the night? Seth's shoulders slumped in exhaustion, but he shook his head. No way, I am not giving up this close to Bear Lake. Come on, slowpoke. Last one there has to build the fire. With that, he charged uphill with renewed vigor. I shouldered my pack with a sigh and continued after him. I couldn't shake the nervous pit growing in my stomach. Pressing on into the twilight woods no longer felt wise. But I didn't want Seth thinking I couldn't handle the full hike. Soon, all sunlight had faded from the dense forest surrounding us. Our headlamps provided only a dim halo of visibility on the narrow path. Strange rustles and cries emanated from the shadows. Even the trees themselves seemed to loom over us menacingly. When we reached a fork splitting off in 2 directions, Seth paused uncertainly. Which way now? I pulled out the map and compass, disoriented. The landscape looked so foreign in the dark. Squinting at the faded lines, I finally pointed left. I think the lake is this way. Seth followed my lead without question. But after 15 more minutes of hiking, there was still no sign of Bear Lake or any place to make camp. His earlier bravado had shifted into tense silence. With each snap of a branch or hoot of an owl, I saw him flinch. "Let's stop and make a fire," I finally said when I noticed Seth rubbing his arms against the dropping temperature. He just nodded, eyes darting suspiciously around us. As I dug a pit and lined it with stones, Seth kept scanning the black spaces between the trees. Once I had a blaze going, he practically collapsed next to it, holding his trembling hands toward the flames. "We just got turned around somehow," I tried reassuring him. "In the morning we can get our bearings again." But Seth didn't seem to hear me. He just kept feeding the fire, craning his neck at every little noise. The dancing firelight cast his features in an increasingly ghoulish glint. I unfurled my sleeping bag, hoping Seth would settle down if I appeared unworried. But each time I drifted off, I'd jerk awake again to the sense of unseen eyes watching from the impenetrable dark. When the first pale light of dawn finally filtered through the canopy, I sat up eagerly. But beside me, Seth's sleeping bag was empty. The dirt around it kicked up as if he'd scrambled away hastily. Heart lurching, I spotted footsteps leading deeper into the trees away from our makeshift camp. "Seth!" I shouted into the misty woods. Only silence answered. He must have gotten disoriented during the night and wandered off. But why leave all his gear behind? I quickly repacked our bags and went to follow his trail. But almost immediately, the tracks disappeared in a dense thicket. How had he gotten so far so fast? "Seth, where are you?" I called out, voice echoing eerily against the blanketing fog. "Can you hear me?" I thought I heard a muffled cry somewhere ahead, but I couldn't tell which direction it came from. Picking my way through scratching underbrush and wet ferns, I searched for any glimpse of my missing boyfriend. Suddenly, I stumbled into a rocky clearing. My blood turned to ice. In the center loomed a stone altar stained dark with something foreboding. Surrounding it were wooden posts adorned with strange symbols and collections of bones. Some kind of pagan ritual space. I spun away, ready to flee in panic, when a crumpled form caught my eye. Seth lay motionless at the far edge of the clearing. My relief was short-lived as I rushed over to find his skin clammy and eyes staring blankly at nothing. "Please wake up." I shook him hard but got no response besides his head lolling limply to the side. I couldn't tell if he was even breathing. Had we accidentally trespassed on the sacred ground of some obscure cult? I knew I had to get Seth help immediately. Flinging his arm over my shoulder, I began dragging his dead weight through the woods back the way I'd come. Sheer adrenaline pushed me onward, even as the day grew hot and muggy. I no longer cared about finding the trail or lake. Just escaping this hateful place mattered now. But despite hours of exhaustive hiking, the scenery barely changed. It was as if the forest itself moved to trap me there. Finally, my shaking legs gave out, and I collapsed under Seth's motionless body. Sobbing in despair, I clung to him. As I smoothed his pale hair back, his eyes suddenly snapped open. I gasped, but any words died in my throat at his wild stare. His irises swirled with unnatural crimson light, burning right through me. When he spoke, an inhuman chorus of voices rasped out instead of his familiar warm tone. "You should not have come here, mortal." I recoiled in horror from the thing masquerading as Seth. It smiled coldly. "We have laid claim to his body and spirit now. He belongs to the old ones, just as all trespassers here do." Cackling as if amused by my whimpers of denial, it turned abruptly and loped back toward the ritual site with astounding speed. I still could not accept the Seth I loved was truly gone, replaced by this demonic force. Blindly, I stumbled after it into the gloom. When I arrived back at the clearing, figures in black robes swayed in a hypnotic dance around the blood-stained stones. The Seth creature stood among them, arms raised to the sky in reverence. Their chants grew louder, drowning out my screams of protest. I bolted forward, no plan in mind beyond rescuing my boyfriend from these lunatics. But an invisible force propelled me backwards before I got close. The robed figures never even glanced my way. Helpless tears streamed down my face as flickering shadows rose from the altar at the ritual's dark crescendo. The forms swirled overhead, funneling into Seth's gaping mouth until his body writhed and contorted in a grotesque manner no living thing should be capable of. Once his gruesome transformation stilled again, he turned to stare at me with those same swirling crimson eyes. The malicious entities spoke through him once more in their haunting chorus. "Your beloved is lost, mortal, and you shall be too if you do not leave these woods before night falls again." Upon hearing their grim warning, my survival instincts finally took precedence over my urge to continue the fight. This was a battle I couldn't win, not if I wanted to make it out of the forest alive. I can only hope the crazy cultists who stole my Seth have no interest in following me back to civilization. But my fear tells me their ritual killings are just the beginning of whatever chaos they intend to unleash from the ancient darkness they worship. If anyone else ventures into those cursed woods, pray you heed the warnings etched into those ritualistic totems, and no matter what beckoning voices call out to you after nightfall, do not follow them. You will find only suffering down the paths they lead you. Some evils should remain undisturbed in the shadows where they dwell, for if awakened, they will claim dominion over everything you hold dear until all light is extinguished from this world forever. The old ones' hunger is ceaseless and untamed, and they are awakening once more.
The Phantom Miners of Bodie, California. The remote and long-abandoned mining town of Bodie, California, was once a booming hub of activity during the gold rush days of the late 1800s. Located in a remote valley east of the Sierra Nevada mountains, Bodie sprang up seemingly overnight after the discovery of gold in 1859. Thousands flocked to the town, seeking riches and opportunities. Saloons, shops, homes, and mines popped up rapidly as Bodie's population swelled to over 10,000 residents in just a few short years. However, by the early 1900s, the gold had dried up and the town was in decline. The mines closed, businesses shuttered, and residents moved on to other towns with more promising prospects. Bodie was eventually completely abandoned by the 1940s, with buildings and belongings left exactly as they were. The town was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1961 and left in a state of arrested decay as a preserved ghost town. And it seems some of Bodie's former residents never left the town, even after death. The spirits of deceased miners are said to still roam the chilly streets and abandoned buildings to this day. Visitors have reported seeing the apparitions of shadowy figures wandering the roads late at night, peering into broken windows, or slowly making their way towards the old mine shafts. Some believe they are the ghosts of miners who perished in accidents, still trying to find their fortune. Others say they are merely the residual hauntings of spirits, continuing the daily routines they followed while alive. Eerie sounds have also been reported coming from the grim Bodie Cemetery on the outskirts of town. Creaking noises emerge from the rickety funeral wagons dotting the graveyard. Howls and cries seem to float on the wind. Gravestones shake and move on their own, as if restless spirits are trapped beneath. And in the middle of the night, phantom lights flicker and glow between the worn wooden crosses, marking forgotten graves. Those who wander the streets of Bodhi typically do so during daylight hours only. Locals strongly advise against exploring Bodhi at night when the phantom miners are said to come out and claim the town for themselves once again. Spirits lurk in every shadowy nook and cranny, guarding the place they once called home in life. Attempts to stay overnight often result in terrifying poltergeist activity and violent threats from the ghostly inhabitants who do not take kindly to visitors overstaying their welcome after dark. Jake Schofield was one such visitor who chose to ignore the warnings. He was a blogger who investigated supposed haunted sites all across the country. Jake figured spending the night recording Bodhi's ghostly phenomenon would make for a great Halloween video on his website. Arriving on a late October afternoon, Jake strolled through the town snapping photos while sunlight still bathed the crumbling buildings. He made sure to capture shots of the abandoned homes, general store, saloon, and mine entrances gaping darkly against the mountainside. As the sun sank lower in the sky, Jake hurried to set up static night vision cameras around what he already determined would be prime ghost hunting spots after scouting the area earlier. By 9 p.m., Jake was ready. He parked himself in the middle of the dusty road, running through town. Turning on an EMF meter to measure electromagnetic energy, Jake called out loudly, "Hello, my name is Jake. I come in peace to this place. I'm here to gather evidence of your existence. Please show yourselves to me tonight." Only the slight rustling of leaves answered his call. Jake knew ghosts tended to take their time making an appearance, if they appeared at all. He had several hours before sunrise to document any paranormal findings. Settling on an overturned crate, Jake took out his digital audio recorder and began asking questions aloud that any spirits nearby could respond to. "What is your name?" Pause. "How did you die?" Pause. "Are you trapped here?" Jake went on like this for nearly 2 hours. But besides the occasional flickering needle on the EMF meter, there seemed to be little ghostly activity stirring. Around midnight, Jake's drooping eyes snapped back open when a sudden loud bang made him jump. It sounded like a rock hitting one of the buildings down the street. Jake leapt up, peering into the darkness, but saw nothing. "Hello," he called tentatively. "Did you make that noise? Please do it again if you want to communicate with me." Silence. Jake's skin prickled with goosebumps as the unearthly cry died off. "Thank you," Jake said excitedly. "Can you make another?" Crash. The deafening sound of shattering glass came from the second floor of the saloon down the road. Adrenaline pumping, Jake began jogging towards the building. But he only made it a few feet when the front doors of the saloon suddenly slammed shut with a resounding bang. Jake stopped short. Cold dread trickled down his spine. The air around him felt charged, pressing down with unspoken warning. This didn't seem like the usual harmless ghosts looking to communicate. Jake slowly began backing away down the street. "Oh, okay. I don't want to intrude here. Thank you for showing yourself. I'll just be leaving now until daylight when I can finish mine." An explosive smash right behind Jake made him whip around with a choked cry. One of his static cameras now lay in pieces on the ground at his feet. Before Jake could react, the EMF meter was torn violently from his shaking hand, sailing through the air to smash into the side of a building. Jake turned and ran. The chilling sound of disembodied laughter seemed to echo all around him. More glass shattered, buildings creaked, heavy footsteps pounded. Jake sprinted out of the town and didn't stop until he reached the safety of his car, parked half a mile down the road. Only once the doors were locked did Jake finally let out the breath he'd been holding in sheer terror. As dawn broke, Jake drove to nearby Carson City and booked a flight home, having captured no ghostly evidence, but vowing to never again stay overnight in the haunted town ruled by its phantom miners after dark. The Curse of Poveglia Island, Italy. Located between Venice and Lido in the Venetian lagoon, you will find Poveglia Island, one of the most haunted and feared locations in Italy. The small island first served as a quarantine colony for plague victims during the Roman era. Black Plague outbreaks continued to sweep through Europe in the 1700s, with Venice being hit particularly hard. At the time, Poveglia Island once again became a dumping ground for diseased corpses and dying plague victims exiled from the mainland. It is estimated that over 160,000 infected men, women, and children came to perish on Poveglia Island over the years. In 1922, the island's horror continued when a psychiatric hospital was opened there. Rumors quickly spread of terrible experiments and torturous treatments performed on patients within its walls. The head doctor was said to have gone mad himself, throwing himself from the hospital tower after being driven insane by the tortured spirits that stalked its corridors. The facility was shut down in 1968, overcrowding and inhumane conditions. Since then, Poveglia Island has been abandoned, left to the mercy of the vengeful souls still inhabiting it. Boats give the island a wide berth, fearful of the otherworldly forces lurking there. Brave visitors who have stepped foot on its shores tell of screams that seem to come from all around, disembodied cries for help, and unexplained cold chills that cut through even the warmest day. Skeletal human remains still wash up along its beaches or poke through the soil. The tortured souls of those who died agonizing plague deaths and mental patients subjected to brutal experiments are said to remain trapped on Poveglia. Their anger and despair permeates the very air. In the crumbling hospital building, ghostly figures have been seen wandering the halls and opening rooms where patients were once locked away. Phantom lights flicker through broken windows. The ground seems to ripple as if still piled high with hastily buried corpses. Yet some require proof before believing such supernatural tales. Giorgio Belvedere was one such skeptic. The loud Italian television host made his living on bombastic shows where he debunked myths and legends. His latest scoffed at the idea that little Poveglia Island was haunted. Giorgio boasted he would spend a week filming there to expose the ghost story as fake once and for all. Despite locals pleading for him not to go, Giorgio arrived via boat with a film crew and cameras one sunny afternoon. As they shot establishing shots, Giorgio hammed it up for the camera. He stomped on the ground, yelling and demanding any spirits show themselves immediately. Crew nervously laughed along as they continued setting up equipment in front of the crumbling hospital. That evening, the crew followed as Giorgio strutted through the hospital halls, shouting taunts. Again, his bravado provoked no paranormal response. By 3 am, Giorgio was growing bored. He left the disappointed crew downstairs and headed up to the bell tower rooftop alone. Sitting against the ledge, Giorgio gazed out at the lights of distant Venice across the dark water. Come on, ghosts. I'm all alone and unarmed. Now's your chance to scare me, Giorgio bellowed into the night. He waited. Just as he was about to shout more insults, a loud thunk came from the floor below, like something heavy falling over. Giorgio leapt up. Had the clumsy crew knocked something over? Cautiously, Giorgio peered down the bell tower steps. A dark mass lay crumpled halfway down. Heart pounding, Giorgio stumbled backward to the rooftop ledge. He squinted in the moonlight, trying to make out what had fallen. The shape suddenly moved. A face turned up to look at Giorgio. A face covered in oozing bloody sores and clouded dead eyes. It opened blackened lips to rasp. Leave now, Giorgio screamed and tumbled over the ledge. The film crew found his body dead on the ground below an hour later. Authorities ruled it a freak accident while under the influence. But those who know Poveglia's cursed history suspect otherwise. The island's angry spirits had finally been provoked too far, and they claimed Giorgio as yet another of Poveglia's victims, now condemned to haunt its plague-ridden grounds for eternity. After all, the dead call Poveglia Island home, and they show no mercy to the living who dare disturb them. The ghost town of Ashcroft, British Columbia. High up in the remote wilderness of British Columbia sits the abandoned ghost town of Ashcroft, frozen in time from its heyday during the gold rush era. Ashcroft sprung to life in the mid-1800s as one of the largest boom towns in the region after gold was discovered along the Bonaparte River. Prospectors flooded in, hoping to strike it rich in the gold-filled creeks and riverbanks surrounding Ashcroft. By the late 1800s, the rough-and-tumble town was home to over 10,000 residents. Several stone and wooden buildings went up rapidly, including a railway station, multiple hotels, stores, saloons, and houses. However, by the early 1900s, the gold deposits began to dry up. People and businesses moved on to more profitable towns. The Ashcroft Cemetery filled with those who died from accidents, violence, disease, starvation, or exposure to the harsh mountain winters. By the 1950s, Ashcroft was completely deserted, with buildings, belongings, and even food left half-finished, as if the entire population had vanished into thin air overnight. In recent decades, Ashcroft has become renowned as an eerie abandoned ghost town preserved in time. Old storefront signs, rusted mining equipment and furnishings remain exactly as they were left decades ago when the town was hastily vacated. But some believe certain spirits never left, still haunting the lonely streets and vacant buildings of Ashcroft. Visitors have reported encountering various ghostly apparitions lurking about town. At the once lavish Ashcroft Hotel, the specter of a young prostitute named Rose is said to still occupy what was once her room. Her silhouette is often glimpsed at the window, beckoning to potential customers of the brothel below. The ominous, glowing eyes of a grizzled prospector have been seen glaring from dark corners late at night before he vanishes into thin air. The rowdy sounds of a boisterous saloon often echo at one dilapidated building, complete with raucous laughter and tinkling piano music. Yet not a soul is inside. Even stranger occurrences have been attributed to the Ashcroft Cemetery on the outskirts of town. Headstones shift and spin on the ground as if pushed by an invisible force. Misty shapes form and walk among the graves, only to disappear when approached. And eerie, glowing orbs of light weave erratically through the site at night, possibly supernatural beings or the trapped spirits of those buried there beneath the cold, hard ground. The ghostly activity is believed to be the work of 3 Chinese immigrants wrongfully accused of murder and lynched in the 1800s. Their unjust executions cursed the town, haunting all who lived and died in Ashcroft in the decades that followed. Now only their restless spirits remain as the caretakers of Ashcroft, protecting it in death since they were sorely failed there in life. Amateur ghost hunter Mike Edwards was eager to experience the ghostly phenomenon rumored to take place in Ashcroft. He packed up his second-hand equipment, EMF detectors, spirit box, infrared camera, and embarked on the long drive into the remote wilderness early one October morning. After passing only a few small towns over several hours, Mike eventually spotted the eerie remains of Ashcroft down a warm gravel road. Pulling up just outside town, Mike unloaded his gear and began the hike down the main street. He swept his camera slowly around, capturing the hollow wooden buildings that lined the road. Twisting vines choked their sagging fronts. Cracks spiderwebbed across dirty windows. A decrepit saloon still had half-full beer steins lining its front porch, flecked with decades of rust. As Mike explored deeper, he felt as if he'd stepped back in time 100 years. He could vividly imagine how bustling and alive Ashcroft must have been during its heyday. Now, only lingering spirits remained. Just past midnight, Mike sat in the cobwebbed lobby of the hotel with all his equipment arranged. "Is there anyone here with me tonight?" he asked, aloud. The spirit box, static, sputtered, but no voices came through. Mike moved to another room and tried again. "Can you tell me your name?" This time, a warbled male voice answered amid the white noise. "We want gold." Mike's eyes widened. "Gold? Is that your name, or are you still seeking gold?" No response came. Mike suddenly recalled the grizzled prospector ghost seen around town. Had the spirit box picked up his voice? Over the next few hours, Mike moved from building to building, asking questions, listening for replies through the spirit box. Catching ghostly voices on tape would be amazing proof to share later online. As dawn approached, Mike headed to the cemetery on Ashcroft's outskirts, utilizing the dead time when spirits were believed most active. Setting the spirit box on a weathered tombstone, Mike said clearly, "Please use this device to speak with me if you are here." Mike waited expectantly as the static filled the quiet morning air. After several long minutes, Mike was about to give up when a faint female voice drifted through the spirit box. "Leave now." Mike stiffened. "Who are you?" he asked. "Did you live in Ashcroft?" "Go. Away. Leave. Us." The female voice insisted, a bit louder. Mike's excitement faded. Maybe he wasn't as welcome as he thought. Respectfully, Mike switched off the spirit box and began packing up to leave. But just as he lifted his camera bag, the distinct voices of 3 men yelled out from the device. "Leave. Now." Mike ran like the dead themselves were on his heels, and didn't stop until Ashcroft was a speck in his rearview mirror. He had captured hours of possible evidence, but Mike knew the restless spirits guarding Ashcroft wished to remain undisturbed in their decaying gold rush ghost town.